All right, and we're live here. It is 7:55, and we're just starting up our Elephant in the Emergency Room, How We Pay for Medicare for All. We're very excited about it. We've got great guests. We've got Mark Dudzik. He's our host with the Labor Campaign for Single Payer, and we will be going live in just a few minutes. My name's Hal Ginsberg. I'm the state organizer. This is our first time doing this, so be kind. We're going to do the best we can to present a really top-notch program for you. We'll be going live at 8 o'clock, and we'll start with our chair, our Revolution Maryland's chair, Bob Mullenkamp. I do ask you, if you are coming on right now and watching, if you can sign into the chat with your name and where you're listening from, which would be really cool if you can do that. We'd love to see where you're calling from. Again, this is the Our Revolution Maryland Elephant in the Emergency Room. Medicare for All saves you money. Get the facts. All right, so I hear you saying you can barely hear me. Let me see if I can get the audio up a little bit. And sorry about that. I think we've got a pretty good thing. Can you boost your audio there, Stephanie, and other folks as well? If you're having any trouble, see if you can get it a little louder. I'm going to get my output just higher if I possibly can, and we'll see if we can get it to a louder volume. But we do see the audio levels are moving. If you are in the chat and you're listening, if you are on board, we do see we have a number of people already who are watching. We'd love to see you. 12 watching now. Please sign in if you can and say hello. Let us know where you are watching from. Clayton says, can't hear you either. So let me see if there's a reason for that. Okay, better, good. There we go. Took a moment for me to get that volume for that to stream out to you. So again, we're Our Revolution Maryland, Elephant in the Emergency Room, Medicare for All saves you money. Get the facts. We're excited to have Mark Dudzik on with the Labor Campaign for Single Payer. Great to see David on board, Gene in Towson, FoodTube, Clayton, Michael, all of you. It's great to see you. And again, just keep putting those names in there. We will have a call to action at the end of the program. We're going to ask you to call Steny Hoyer, the majority leader. We do have his link in the description right below the image there. And we're going to go to Bob in just a moment. Bob Mullenkamp, who is the chair of Our Revolution Maryland. So we're really excited as well to have Bob with us. And we've got lots of great folks who are going to be on speaking with you in just a few moments. It's just 7:58:30. We broadcast this to begin at 8 p.m. If you get on and you want to sign in and tell us where you are, we'd love to see who you are and where you are. Again, this is the Our Revolution Maryland broadcast of the Elephant in the Emergency Room. Medicare for All saves you money. Get the facts. And again, this is our first live stream in this manner, where we're using the YouTube live stream. So we may have a few glitches. If we do, we apologize for them in advance. Again, if you can sign in, log in, let us know you're watching. We have 28 people now. We want to get to 150 would be awesome. Denise, now in Tillman Island, Maryland. And in about 35, 40 seconds, we'll go to Bob Mullenkamp. He is the chair of Our Revolution Maryland. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute Bob, but we'll get to him in just a moment. I'll go to him at exactly 8 o'clock. So again, we're really excited to be broadcasting to you this great webinar, Medicare for All, the Elephant in the Emergency Room. Thanks everyone who's signing in. Jessica, Paul, Ed, Denise, awesome to see all of you in the room. And now we've got our countdown. We're just about ready for Bob. So Bob, if you're ready, we're going to go to you right now. My honor, Bob Mullenkamp, chair of Our Revolution Maryland.
Thank you, Hal. And I want, on behalf of the 19 members of our state organizing committee, to welcome you to this unique conversation about Medicare for All. First, I want to thank our Howard County chapter for hosting the original conversation about this on January 25th. And in particular, Paul Basich, the chair of the Howard County chapter, who had planned on doing this just for Howard County tonight, but agreed that this is so important, so interesting, we should spread it around Maryland and indeed around the country. So thank you, Howard County. When we had the initial conversation about this in Howard County on January 25th, 10 weeks ago, we had no idea where we would be 10 weeks later. It feels like 10 years. Bernie was running for president. Medicare for All was very much on the national agenda. 10 weeks later, we're in the virus catastrophe. Bernie is no longer running for president, but Medicare for All is even more important and more on the agenda of this country than it was 10 weeks ago when we started this conversation. So let me frame what this discussion is about. Many, if not most or all of us, have been to Medicare for All conferences over the years. And basically, we've done 5 things at those conferences. We've talked about how healthcare is a moral issue, that it's a human right. We've talked about, we have people come to the conferences who tell their stories. They tell their stories about how their kid has some disease that they permanently have to deal with, and they just don't have the money for their drugs anymore. They talk about having to go bankrupt. They talk about having to decide whether or not to spend money on food or tuition or for drugs. And we tell those horror stories, and every family knows of someone personally who has a horror story to tell. Third, we make clear that we are the only industrial country in the world that does not have a national healthcare system. Fourth, we make it clear that this country spends twice as much as any other country in the world on healthcare and yet has very, very poor outcomes. We have won the debate on those issues. We have made it clear that on its merits, Medicare for All is what America needs. And thanks to many years of work by our very distinguished presenter tonight, Mark Dudzik, and many others over many years, and over the last 5 or 6 years, Bernie especially, a majority of Americans now agree that we should have Medicare for All. So on its merits, we have won the debate about Medicare for All. And because we've won that debate, and because a majority of Americans now agree with us, we're now under attack for, okay, so how are you going to pay for it? And aren't people going to pay more taxes? And they're going to have to pay more money. And if we think back to these various conferences that we've all been to over the years, we do those 5 things I discussed, and then someone stands up and says, but how are we going to pay for it? How much is it going to cost me? Are we going to have taxes? And what happens is we don't answer that well. We are immediately on the defensive. We give some vague answer about, well, we pay twice as much as everyone else. It should be easy. Or we talk about waste, fraud, and corruption and profits. But we are not answering it well. We have not risen to this challenge, and we are on the defensive. So what's this conversation tonight? This conversation tonight is how to go on the offensive. How to begin the conversation with how Medicare gets paid for, how much my family saves. We're not going to run away from the dirty 5-letter word called taxes. We're going to have a discussion tonight about how to go on the offensive about taxes. And just to give a sense of where we're going to end on this. When you take into account premiums, deductibles, co-pays, and out-of-pocket expenses, and taxes, every family in America, 95% of families in America save money under Medicare for All. The average family saves $10,000. The average employer who covers their employees now with healthcare saves $9,000. That's the conversation we want to have. How can we go on the offensive? How can we start the conversation about how we pay for and families save money under Medicare for All? So with that, it's really my honor to introduce one of the people who has brought this struggle successfully to the national agenda. Mark Dudzik is a longtime union activist and union organizer and the coordinator of the union campaign for a single payer. And even more important, maybe, Mark is an activist in our Howard County chapter. So Mark, take it away.
Can you hear me now? Shake your head yes if you can.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Bob. It's great to be here, folks. I want to just shout out to my chapter, Howard County chapter of Our Revolution. Paul Basich, the chair, is the one who thought of the cute title for this, The Elephant in the Emergency Room, How Do We Pay for Medicare? And we were going to do this in the one of the Howard County libraries on March 21st, but the coronavirus put a stop to that. So this is an experiment on doing an online webinar, and I hope everyone will bear with us and be patient as we move through the presentation tonight. I'd also just like to recognize my sister organization, the Debs Jones Douglas Institute. They have done most of the research backing up the information that we're going to convey tonight, and my colleague Catherine Isaac was instrumental in putting this presentation together. So as Bob said, since we talked about this issue at the state meeting in Cooksville, Maryland at the end of January, the coronavirus crisis has just massively reshaped the narrative about the healthcare crisis and about what's possible and what's needed to provide decent healthcare for everybody in America. We know, of course, that we're in the midst of this massive public health crisis in this dysfunctional system that makes it really difficult for people to coordinate care, that's rife with profiteering and inequality, unequal access to care, and all of the public health problems. And we're also just beginning to realize that we are in the midst of a major economic crisis, something that none of us alive today probably have ever lived through. And just a couple of figures as we go forward to think about this is in the next month or so, possibly 35 million Americans may lose their employer-provided health care, and will have to find other ways to access health care. And another figure that's been bouncing around is when we get to the other end of this crisis next year, people are predicting that insurance rates may go up as high as 40% in 1 year to cover for the privatized costs of this social crisis. So that's really kind of changed the narrative and the urgency of what we're talking about. And one other thing that's kind of changed in the last couple of months, and that is a sudden realization that when we are faced with crisis, and especially when rich folks are endangered by a crisis, trillions of dollars can suddenly materialize out of thin air that we never thought we would see. 6 months ago, people were attacking Bernie Sanders for, proposing a higher ed program that might have cost 60 or 70 billion dollars per year. The Federal Reserve last week pulled $2.3 trillion out of thin air to bail out the bond markets and the corporate junk bond investments to ensure liquidity in the markets. So the kind of money that we're talking about tonight is much more understandable that a society can conjure up that kind of money when we set our priorities properly. So that's important to understand, and it changes the politics of this. But nonetheless, we think it's really important for us all to learn as activists, how to talk to people about how we are going to pay for Medicare for all, and to show them that there is a model that can to have a sustainable healthcare system that will save everybody money while providing quality healthcare to everybody in America. So I want to give just one proviso before we get started here. This is a presentation that is meant for organizers, not wonks. We're working here to simplify some really complex health policy information. And we're doing that so that we can take this information with us when we talk to our neighbors and our coworkers and our friends, and help them understand the costs and the savings that are involved in this, and hope that understanding will move them to action. So I will try to indicate briefly, where we're kind of simplifying some of these issues, and if you're of interest, there's plenty of ways to follow up on that. There's a couple of references throughout the show to follow up on it. But what we're trying to do is give you some ideas about how to talk to people about this very important question. So if you have questions, and Hal, correct me if I'm wrong, you should write them in the chat section as we go along. And when I'm done with my presentation, Aruna will facilitate a Q&A period, and then we'll go from there. The other thing I understand is that the slideshow that we're going to go through will be available on the Our Revolution Maryland website at some point shortly after the presentation. So if people are interested in these slides, you should have access to them. So Hal, if you could cue up the slideshow at this point, we can move into this.
I will in a sec. I just want to say we do have some issues with the slides. We'll do the best we can, and I am responsible for that. I do apologize. We're going to do the best we can with this, though.
Okay, so we are going to be talking about how we will pay for Medicare for all. Next slide, please. So first, for purposes of the discussion tonight, we will be focusing on the one half of all Americans who currently get their health care through employment-based care. If you see this, this slide here, people have a number of different ways that they access health care, and some people, 9% of us, have no way to directly access it because they are completely uninsured. But this talk is really geared towards those who get employment-based care. These are the people that Joe Biden say love their health care so much that they don't want to give it up for a Medicare for all system. And we're going to convince them that they would be stupid not to give it up for a Medicare for all system. And hopefully you'll be able to walk away tonight with some talking points to do so. I'd also point out that folks who are accessing healthcare through some of these other forms, Medicare, individual insurance, even Medicaid, encounter some of the same issues and problems that face us, those of us who get it through employment-based healthcare. So, a lot of these talking points can be used in other circumstances also. Okay, next slide, please. So how much do you pay for healthcare? I hope you all did your homework and used that healthcare cost calculator that was sent out with the call notice to come out with your household's healthcare costs. It can be a real kind of an eye-opening experience. That form was developed by a union called the United Electrical Workers to help their members prepare for contract bargaining. But I think it's a great kind of kitchen table exercise to really sit down and figure this out. So let's look at just a couple of sample forms that we got in. Next slide. So this is a family of four who has really good health care coverage. They're making about $118,000 a year. They're kicking in about $11,700 through their paycheck deductions. And then they haven't had too many medical expenses over the year. They've paid $2,500 in copays, and some drug money and vision care and dental costs. So this family is paying about $15,000 a year for health care out of their family budget, and that's about 12.7% of their budget. Next slide. So here's another family. It's a two-person family. One person is working and one is semi-retired and has pension and Social Security. They're making about $128,000 a year, paying $6,400 out of paycheck deduction for their portion of the healthcare insurance they get on the job, and then a whole bunch of not shocking, but some medical expenses adding up to $9,000 out of pocket. So they're paying $16,000 a year out of pocket, and that's about 12.5% of their family income. So those are very, typical kind of stories for pretty comfortable middle-class families who got decent jobs and decent healthcare insurance. And these folks have been lucky enough not to have experienced a major illness or other medical expense in their family. And we have on the call tonight a couple of people who haven't been that lucky. So Sydney, can you sort of tell your story real quick? Got to unmute Sydney.
Okay, yeah, I'm unmuted. Okay, so thanks, Mark. So my husband and I have been very fortunate to have health insurance that is very good. It allows us to see any health provider we choose. And we do have resources to pay our premiums and our copays. So it's never been a huge issue for us until this past year when things changed. In mid-August, I was admitted to the hospital with a very fast-moving sepsis infection. I was in the hospital for 3 weeks, including about a week in intensive care. And then when I got home, it took many months to recover completely. It required 2 more months of intravenous antibiotics and other outpatient treatment and home health care as well. So the other part of this was I also turned 65 last year, so I became eligible for Medicare Part A. And I only signed up for Part A because my husband is still working and we still have our health insurance. And after repeatedly asking what does Part A cover, I was assured that it covered hospitalization. So what I found out, though, was that it covered the room I was staying in, and it didn't cover my physicians or a lot of my other treatment that I had in the hospital. So we ended up having a lot of out-of-pocket expenses. We met our catastrophic deductible. And so as you can see on the chart here, our final costs, and that include what we paid for our premiums, was a little over $19,000, which very roughly was about 17% of our income last year.
Thanks, Sydney. Chrissy, can you join us and tell your story? Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Mark, for the opportunity. So just quick, my son 25 years ago was born uninsurable with severe hemophilia A. And so it's been a decades-long journey to figure out how to have his medication covered. Today we have Federal Blue Cross Blue Shield for life. My husband retired from the federal government. It's the gold standard, right? It's the best policy you can have. He's got 1 more year left on it. And so we pay a little over $7,000, out of our paycheck, 70, in premiums, $600 a month. And we always hit our $10,000 catastrophic every January for the first shipment of the clotting factor. So I have my Blue Cross Blue Shield bill here from February, and our bills run, this one is, because February is a short month, this one was $37,000 for February. So we have spent years working on policies to have our medication covered, and the insurance company fights us on the other side. So sometimes we can get coupons from our drug companies to help cover the cost of the medication, but the insurance companies will come up and fight against our families, so that essentially making it that we can't use the coupons and we have to pay the money out of our pockets. And so I don't love my insurance company, and I wish that I had Medicare for all. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chrissy, for sharing your story with us. Okay, Hal, next slide. So after listening to our friends and neighbors on this call, and probably looking at your own experiences, it should really come as no surprise what an average working class family of four spends on healthcare with decent private insurance. There is a consulting firm called the Millman Firm that does an annual Millman Medical Index, and they have calculated that a working class family of four who earns about $90,000 a year and has a decent PPO style plan from their employer, probably not unlike the ones we were just talking about, that the total healthcare costs for that family come to about $28,000 per year. And out of that, the employer is paying about $16,000 and the family is paying about $12,000. Now, I want to just point out that the Millman Index is based on a more privileged subset of that 49% of all Americans who get their health care through their employment. These are people who have a good plan and are earning actually quite a bit more than the median household income in the country, which is down in the 60,000s. So you can look at other sources. The Kaiser Family Fund does some extensive demographic numbers and see how this plays out in other ways. But I think that especially for the folks we're talking about in our communities, these numbers are really, will really resonate with people. So the next slide, please. So this is what how that $12,000 kind of breaks down for current health spending. The household is spending about $7,700 for their share of the premium. And it's funny, I think the folks who had the federal health plan were almost exactly at $7,700 in paycheck deduction for health insurance. And then they spend on average about $4,700 in out of pocket. We saw the range tonight ranged from about $2,000 up to over nearly $20,000. So that's what's coming out of an average family's pocket, $12,000 a year. Those of us who are lucky enough to have decent health care coverage are kicking out around $12,000 a year. So next slide, please. So how much would you pay? This comes out of the financing proposals that Senator Bernie Sanders posted to discuss how options to pay for his Senate healthcare bill. This is an income tax based option. It's a 4% marginal rate on incomes over $29,000. So you need to subtract $29,000 from your current income to get the, and then take 4% of that to get the rate. So it's not 4% of your income, it's your income minus 27,000 times 4%. So there's some other ways to do this other than a marginal tax rate. A lot of unions say that they would prefer a employee contribution to a payroll tax, somewhere in the 2 to 3% of earned income basis. But I will tell you that the numbers tend to kind of come out about the same in terms of what a contribution should be for good in, under a Medicare for All proposal. Next slide. So if you take that chart and you apply it to our family of four earning $90,000 a year, their total healthcare expense for the year would be $2,400 in new taxes. So there are new taxes. Just like our enemies say, you're going to pay new taxes. You're going to pay $2,400 in new taxes. And you're going to save $10,000. That household will save $10,000 over what they are currently paying. Of course, as they say on those late night ads, your savings may vary. Next slide, please. So when you play with these numbers and you move them forward, if you do the math, everyone with a household income of less than $350,000 will pay less than they're currently paying. $350,000 happens to be just about where the income line is for the top 5% of income earners in this country. So under this financing scheme, 95% of households will save money. And the households that we'll be talking to will be saving somewhere in the range of $10,000. Next slide. But wait, there's more. I told you about the current employer healthcare spending of $16,000. That's what employers, responsible employers, contribute for healthcare. Those are the employers who are contributing for a family plan, for a good PPO style healthcare plan like the federal employee health plan. They're kicking in an additional $16,000 beyond what you pay. Now, these are responsible employers. Walmart does not kick in $16,000. McDonald's does not kick in $16,000. Uber, et cetera, et cetera. But those employers who either are compelled by union contracts or other reasons to provide decent health care, that's the average that they're currently paying. So next slide, please. Bernie Sanders is proposing that employers make a contribution of 7.5% of income through a payroll tax to cover health care for all of their employees. So on that family of earning $90,000 a year, their employer or employers will pay a payroll tax of 7.5%. So they will pay $6,750 into the pot for the healthcare coverage for their employees earning $90,000. So they're going to save $9,000 from what they're currently paying. Responsible employers will pay $90,000. Next slide. Is this, what will people say to you when you tell them that under Medicare for All, their family is going to save $10,000 and their employer's going to save $9,000? They're just going to say, how is this possible? It just sounds too good to be true. So let's look at the numbers. Let's take a little time to look at the numbers about why this is going to be true. Next slide, please. So first, let's talk about what we need to pay for under a model Medicare for All plan. Because we need to pay for a lot more than what our current insurance plans are paying for. First, we got to go to universal coverage. There's 28 million people now who have no insurance. We've got to bring them up and provide coverage for them. Secondly, we have to come up with comprehensive coverage that covers preventive care, vision, dental, and hearing, mental health, prescriptions, reproductive and maternity. And this is a big one, especially for families that are looking at aging parents or are aging themselves. Long-term care, which is a disgrace the way it's currently handled in the U.S. So we've got to come up with a whole series of comprehensive coverage items. Just transition. There will be workers, somewhere in the area of 1.8 million workers, who will be displaced as a result of Medicare for All. These are people who work for insurance companies, and these are people who work in doctors' offices and hospitals and other healthcare employment, whose job it is to argue with those insurance companies. It's a lot of people. They don't really add any value to healthcare delivery, but they are, in general, working folks trying to earn a living. We feel that it is crucial anytime you propose a major public policy reform that affects the livelihood of working people, that you need to make those people whole. The same way as when you propose to build a highway through someone's front yard, you make them whole for the loss of that property. And we also think from a political reason that if we do not proactively provide a just transition for any worker who's affected by this, that our enemies will use those workers as shock troops to divide working people against each other and to make it much harder for us to win this fight. So we got to come up with real money for just transition for those workers. We need to budget that into the whole package. In addition, we have to increase the equity of our healthcare system. There are huge racial and geographic disparities built into this system. They need to be addressed immediately so that we can begin to provide a single standard of care for all Americans. And then finally, we're going to eliminate all the cost barriers, all the co-pays, all the premiums, all the deductibles, all of that money that comes out of your pocket has to be eliminated. So there's a lot of new things we got to add into this system. Next slide. So all of these additions will increase the total demand for healthcare, the total cost that we pay for healthcare, by approximately 12%. So now we're at 112% of what we're currently paying if we continue to pay for it the way we do now. Next slide. But there's also going to be considerable savings under Medicare for All. This chart came from an organization called the Perry Institute at the University of Massachusetts. It's a peer-reviewed economic study of Medicare for All, and they were very, very conservative in the estimates of savings. So they are claiming an administrative savings of at least 9%. That is by eliminating all of the inefficiencies and profiteering involved in administering multiple insurance plans and accounting for all of the various billing methods and approvals and all of the waste and inefficiency that's built into our system. They're also estimating a savings of close to 6%, 5.9%, because the federal government will now negotiate prescription drug prices, and there will be teeth in that negotiating authority. We'll save another 2.8% because there will be uniform rates for procedures and not all of the manipulation and multiple rates that take place right now, and another 1.5% just by eliminating all the waste and fraud that's built into the system. So we would save 19.2% of what we're currently paying now under Medicare for All, under very conservative estimates. There's other organizations. There's a study published in The Lancet, which is a peer-reviewed British medical magazine, that estimates actually much higher savings rates than these. Next slide. So when you add up that extra 12% and subtract the 19% that were savings, we basically have to come up with about $2.96 trillion per year to pay for healthcare, which is less than what we're paying for now, but is still a whole lot of money. That's a lot of money. Fortunately, what we're currently paying under existing taxes for healthcare already comes to $1.88 trillion a year. So what we are paying right now for Medicare, for Medicaid, for children's health benefits, for TRICARE, for military families, for federal employee health benefits, and some of the other federal health programs, when you add all of that up, you come up with $1.88 trillion. So if we just keep paying that amount into one big pot, Medicare for All, then we need to raise $1.08 trillion in new money to pay for Medicare for All. So how are we going to get that? Next slide. So that new income tax that Bernie proposes for his plan, the 4% on 29,000, is going to put $350 billion more into that pot. And then the new employer payroll tax, 7.5% payroll tax, will put $390 billion into that pot. So between the two, we're already 3/4 of the way into financing Medicare for all. And if only there was an untapped source of wealth somewhere where we could fill that gap of $270 billion. Next slide. So we at the Labor Campaign for Single Payer, Debs Jones Douglas, think that in fact the time has come to shift the burden paying for health care onto those who can most afford to pay it, and that those who have reaped the benefit of the last nearly 50 years of runaway inequality in this society should be prepared to pay their fair share into a healthcare system that covers everybody. Next slide. And lest you feel that sounds a little bit too radical or unfair, I just would like you to take a quick look at this chart. It's a little complex, but the red line charts how worker productivity has improved since 1947 until 2016. And you'll see that there's pretty much a steady rise. Every year, workers are producing a little more than they produced the year before, and making more products or more services year in and year out because they're more efficient and have better technology and all of those other reasons. And you'll also, the solid blue line is a chart that charts workers' average weekly wages. And you'll see that for a whole long period of time after World War II, workers' productivity and workers' wages increased almost in lockstep. You made more product, you made more money. And that happened year in and year out, lockstep, for a number of years into the mid-1970s. And suddenly there was a huge break in that practice. And wages basically stagnated for the last 50 years, close to 50 years now. And productivity continued to improve. So you can't really read that number on this slide, but the average worker's wage right now is about $746 per week. And if they had increased in lockstep with productivity, the average worker's wage would be $1,377 per week. So it's that gap between those two numbers where the opportunity to pay for Medicare for all and a whole slew of other public goods just might be. Next slides, please. So there's a bunch of ways you can recover those ill-gotten gains. These are some ideas that the Perry Institute has come up with some estimates. You will see that there's way more than what we need to come up with that approximately 260 billion that we need. You could institute a wealth tax at about 1%, 2% of wealth over 50 million. You could tax long-term capital gains at the same rate of that people like you and I have to pay income tax at. You raise a couple $100 billion like that. You could restore the corporate tax rate back to 35%. Didn't seem to be a huge burden on corporations, and raise a couple $100 billion there. Tax corporations. This is the inequality tax. Those corporations that have a huge pay gap between what a CEO earns and what an average worker earns ought to pay a penalty for that pay gap. And then you could do a small financial transaction tax on stocks and bonds. So those are some options that are out there that could easily raise more than enough money to fill that gap in Medicare for all. Next slide, please. And these policies are widely supported by the American people. 66% support a wealth tax, 69% believe that corporations are paying too little, 59% think we ought to raise the highest tax rate to 70%, which is actually less than what people paid during the Eisenhower administration. 76% think that the wealthiest should pay higher taxes, and 75% think corporations should pay higher taxes. So these are very popular policies that enjoy broad support and bipartisan support from the American people. Next slide. So there we are. We have the simple scenario here, backed up by some real numbers, and this is how we talk about it. The average household will save $10,000. Those who earn less than $350,000 will pay less. 95% of all households will pay less under Medicare for All. Responsible employers will save money, up to $9,000 per employee under Medicare for All. We eliminate the profits. We have a net savings of 7.2% over what we're currently paying under our healthcare system, even though we cover everybody with no financial barriers of care. And we shift the burden to the wealthy and those who are most able to assume the burden. It's a simple talk. You do kitchen table economics. People sit down, they look at their own circumstances, and they look at these numbers, and I think that we can move beyond the group of true believers and move into our communities and into our workplaces and really build a powerful movement that not only thinks it's the morally right thing to do to provide health care for everybody, but understands and believes that it is possible and practical and is the economically correct thing to do for a prosperous society that treats people with respect. So we are going to ask Aruna Miller to facilitate some quick questions. So Aruna, are you with us? Hal, can you help us here?
We had a little problem with Aruna. She should be in now. Do we have you, Aruna?
I'm here. Can everyone hear
Awesome.
me?
Yes, great.
Okay. Well,
Aruna, could
first,
you
Mark,
speak up just a little bit?
can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay. Mark, thank you for that fabulous presentation and for your years of being dedicated as a union organizer and for being a champion of Medicare for All. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Okay, great. So here's a question for you. We've been hearing a lot about Joe Biden lowering the Medicare eligibility age from 65 to 60. Do you think this is a good compromise?
Yeah, well, no, I think, I mean, here we are at a moment, we're in a major crisis. We just came out of a primary election where majorities of Americans, even when they were bombarded with all kinds of negative advertising, are now supporting Medicare for All. And the best that Joe could come up with is knocking down the Medicare eligibility by 5 years. There's a bunch of reasons why this is not a real great policy. I mean, some people will benefit by it. So, it's better than nothing, I suppose. But number one, it does not break the link between employment and healthcare that we have just been talking about. This weird thing we have in our society that nowhere else in the world has, that says that if you work, you're supposed to get your healthcare from your employment, that healthcare is a benefit, not a right. Moving this down will still mean that almost all of us will have to continue to be dependent on our employers to provide healthcare for us and pay all of the kind of money that we're currently paying. Secondly, it doesn't really solve all of the costs integrated into this system, all of the waste and the inefficiency and the profit taking, which makes this the world's most expensive healthcare system by far. So it doesn't change any of those dynamics. So you're not saving any money. This is, all of these politicians who kept going after people like Bernie, saying, Bernie, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? They were talking out of the other side of their mouth when they were trying to claim that they could cover all Americans under some scheme of theirs. but never were held accountable for what it would cost. Because if you want to cover all Americans under our current system, you're going to be paying a whole lot more than the 3.23 trillion that we're currently paying. So it doesn't save any of the cost issues. Thirdly, it doesn't improve Medicare. The thing about the Medicare expanded and improved Medicare for all is our Medicare system, after 50 years of austerity politics and right-wing attacks, has got a whole bunch of holes in it. We have some considerable amount of deductibles and co-payments built into the system. There's huge gaps in coverage. Doesn't cover dental, doesn't cover vision, doesn't cover long-term care. So we got to fix Medicare as it is, and not just move it down. And then finally, this is really this is what centrist Democrats do all the time. They bargain against themselves. They open the bargaining with what they think the other side is willing to accept, thinking that that's going to be the easy way out. And in the end, they end up with much less than what they started out with. And any shop steward would know that, or would learn really damn quick, that when you bargain against yourself, you end up with nothing. And to start, the negotiations over the future of healthcare in America by calling for a modest reduction in Medicare eligibility, we have a chance maybe once every decade to make a substantial change in healthcare policy. And this is what we're going to waste it on? Anyways, I could go on, but let's take another question.
All right. Thanks for that, Mark. So Stephanie asks this question: is mental health parity a part of the bill?
Absolutely. That's very important. Mental health parity and addiction services are really under played in private healthcare insurance and some of the Medicare and Medicaid policies. One thing that I really respected about Congresswoman Jayapal is that when she wrote her updated Medicare for All bill in the House, she spent a lot of time talking to mental health communities, underserved communities, really wanted to make sure that their concerns were centered in this. Not only is mental health care included, but in the House bill, there is a bias towards community-based care, which is very important to both folks suffering from mental health issues and also many disability issues, is that, as much as possible, the care should be given on a community basis and not on an institutionalized basis.
Great. That's good to know, Mark. Jean asked this question: what about undocumented workers and their families?
So we believe that I'm speaking for the labor campaign for single payer, that the system only works when everybody is in. Everybody needs to be in, nobody out of the system. We all pay into it based on how much we're able to pay, and we all receive healthcare as a matter of right, and should not be based on any other qualifiers than that. Both federal bills, the House and the Senate bill, say that it will be available for all residents of the United States. So that's what I guess perhaps a court might be able to interpret what that would mean down the line, but that's what the current legal language is.
Okay. So we have a question from Clayton. We know that medical debt is one of the number one reasons why Americans claim bankruptcy. So given this, what would happen to people who already have medical debt under Medicare for All?
There is no provision in the legislation to forgive already existing medical debt. So there would need to be some other kind of relief measure to forgive that. But there would, the Medicare medical debt would be inconceivable once we had a Medicare for All system. There would be no such thing as medical debt accumulated in the future. But there is no provision. Like Bernie has a provision to relieve students of student debt under his free higher ed provision. There's not currently any such provision regarding medical debt. And it's a good question, and someone ought to look into that more extensively and see if it's possible to wrap something into this legislation or some other legislation.
Great. Thank you for that, Mark. One final question for you. Why are we not seeing businesses rally behind Medicare for All, as it would ultimately save them lots of money?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've struggled with that question a lot. I've spent most of my life as a trade union person and bargained with employers and saw how much they had to pay and compared to what they paid in other countries. But I've come to the conclusion that there's two kinds of business. I think small business, we can win them over, and there's been some real successful organizing with small business, that those are businesses run by flesh and blood human beings and with real connections to communities and healthcare costs of their own. So I think we can win small business over. I think in general that big business has this sort of ideological opposition to any kind of converting a for-profit commodity into a public good. They have a much better sense of class solidarity than the American working class has, I think, at times. They understand that an attack on a healthcare profiteer is an attack on all profiteers everywhere, and that it would open the doors to a number of other demands for public goods that they wouldn't be prepared to give. And the other thing that it does is it will disrupt the power relations between labor and capital in the workplace. I mean, if you can tell the boss to take a hike and not worry about losing your health care, or leave to start a new business or to go back to school and not worry about losing your health care, you have a whole lot more bargaining power than you have right now. If you know when you go on strike that you're going to lose your health care, the boss has a whole lot more bargaining power. So there's a lot of issues, I think, that keep big business from jumping on the bandwagon. But I think at some point, even some of them will see that the cost curve is so great that they're going to have to bite the bullet and move on.
All right, Aruna, that's
Thank
great.
you so much, Mark.
Thanks.
And
Great
I think
questions, folks.
that was great. And now we're going to do our call to action. We do have Suchitra Balachandran, and I put on the screen the link to call Hoyer. But Suchitra, let me turn it over to you, please.
Thanks, Hal, and thank you very much, Mark, for your very detailed presentation and for all the insights that you brought into it, much further beyond than the financial aspects. Just the depth of presentation was just spectacular. I thank you on behalf of all of us who are listening to it. I'm sorry our time is up for questions, but please send us all your questions and any that may come up later to our email address, which Hal will again tell you about later. It's hal@ourrevolution.com. We'll attempt to answer more questions and post responses on our website. You'll find the slide deck there, and you'll also find additional supporting documents. I know that if you're watching this webinar, that you're all hopping mad. You were all hopping mad before this at the way Medicare for All was treated, and you can probably sit on your seats at this moment and say, we've got to go out and we've got to do something about this. So that's basically my task today, to tell you what we should do and why we should do what it is that we're recommending. So I'm going to ask all of you to call Congressman Steny Hoyer's office. And so let me just lay out the reasons for that and what it is we want to ask him. So there are two bills, right? There's two Medicare for All bills, one in the House and one in the Senate. The bill in the House is the lead sponsor is Representative Pramila Jayapal, and of course, the bill sponsor in the Senate is Senator Bernie Sanders. The House bill is where we think we have the most traction, is where we should have the most traction, because the Democrats are obviously in the majority in the House. And the House bill currently has 118 co-sponsors on the bill, which is just over 50% of House Democrats. Among those who have co-sponsored the bill from Maryland are Representatives Anthony Brown, Jamie Raskin, John Sarbanes, and the late Elijah Cummings. Among those who is conspicuously missing in the list of co-sponsors is the House Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer. Steny Hoyer has been in the House now since 1981, and so you can add up and find out how many years that is. He's the majority leader, second only to Speaker Nancy Pelosi. It has been very difficult moving this bill through committees. It did get one hearing in the Energy and Commerce Committee, but it has been really hard pushing this through. And it's kind of odd, right? If you look at it and think about it, why is the majority leader with the minority of Democrats in the House? I mean, does it make any sense? Shouldn't he be leading the majority of the House and not the minority of the House of Democrats? It makes no sense, right? And he's from Maryland, and he's a very powerful leader. So for all those reasons, we're urging you to call Congressman Hoyer's office. Whether or not you live in his district, it does not matter. There is a link at the bottom of the screen which is www.ourrev.us, and it says /MD call M4A. That will take you to a dialer. The dialer will be up even past this webinar, after this webinar ends. So you can call now if you want and get a recording. You can call in the morning and speak to someone there. And the message we have for Congressman Hoyer is that Maryland wants him to co-sponsor HR 1364, which is the Medicare for All bill that's in the House. It's a simple ask. There is no reason for him to be sitting on the fence on this or telling us he supports Medicare, that he supports the Affordable Care Act, or that he supports the public financing option. We know that all of those are more expensive and will cover less than Medicare for All. So the ask to Congressman Steny Hoyer from Maryland is that Maryland wants him to support Medicare for All. Thanks.
All right, thanks everybody for a great presentation, especially, of course, our host, Mark Dudzik, but our chair, Bob Mullenkamp, Sushitra, chair of Our Revolution, Prince George's County, Sydney, Chrissy for sharing their healthcare stories, and Aruna for doing a great job with the questions. Thanks all for watching and sticking with us for this. We're going to have many more presentations like this, and we look forward to seeing you at our next events. Our next full statewide meeting will be on May 2nd, and we'll have much more information very, very soon. Thank you again for watching and being part of Our Revolution, Maryland.